5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We are live. Coming to you live. Has it been live? Say what's up to the people, Dad.
Hey, I want to share with you an insight from Sam's brilliant mom, my incredible wife, Karen Strickler. She is an expert in messaging, and she's tried to develop a message in response to Trump. And she says it's just impossible because Trump, everyone says, and I've said this, he's Orwellian. Well, she points out he's beyond Orwellian, or the Orwellian authoritarianism is pretty straightforward. The thing with Trump is it's accompanied by incredible daily, really hourly chaos, which makes it almost impossible to respond to. She calls it, and I love this metaphor, that it is authoritarianism in a blender. And I think that really encapsulates the way Trump is trying to impose his dictatorial will upon the American people. And we will try to catch up a little bit tonight. I've had my own term. It's not my own term. I've seen the term Gish Gallop, too, is another indicative term that he throws so much out at you, so many lies, so much chaos, so many dictatorial acts that it's just impossible for anyone to keep up and respond to it. We'll at least respond to a few tonight, even though obviously we can't deal with everything in one show.
All right. Do we want to start with... You said today you didn't want to call it deportations because what Trump is doing and or planning is even greater than deportations. Obviously, he's deporting many Central and South Americans, but he yesterday floated the idea again that he might want to essentially exile quote, what he calls homegrown criminals. So if you commit a crime into the U.S., you get sent to a prison in El Salvador.
Wouldn't that apply to Trump? He's convicted of 34 felonies. Well, shouldn't he be? Of course, he qualified it by saying only violent criminals.
Right. And look, nobody believes that criminals, he says Democrats want criminals running in the streets and they love, nobody wants criminals or bad people running the streets, right?
In fact, crime dropped sharply under Biden, contrary to all the lies Elon Musk and the Republican allies were spreading about crime running rampant. In fact, they had some quarrels, remember, with the New York prosecutor, Alvin Bragg, claiming, how horrible crime was in New York. Well, it turns out, it was worse in districts in cities in or near the Republican Congress people who were complaining about New York, which is one of our safest, not one of our crime-ridden cities.
It's pretty remarkable. Essentially, like I said, he wants to exile Americans. Again, they're criminals, right? They deserve to go to jail, or at least deserve to be
provided
trialed.
They're convicted
right, again,
now.
Right, that's another thing, yeah.
One thing about these deportations, which we'll be talking about in a moment, there's no due process. Trump just waves his magic wand, says they're dangerous gang members, and they're off to this virtual concentration camp. Not death camp, but concentration camp in El Salvador.
Yeah. What was I going to say?
Well, let's move on.
Okay. But, that's pretty... I don't know. I was shocked when I heard him actually say that. That's some of the most totalitarian shit I've ever heard.
It is the most totalitarian utterance to come out of a president in our history. The only thing even remotely comparable, which everyone acknowledges was a huge mistake, Congress has apologized for it, was the internment of Japanese Americans. But that was the middle of war. As bad as it was, it doesn't compare to what Trump is proposing. No war, and not even keeping people in the U.S., where after the war, of course, they could return to their homes. They suffered great hardships and, couldn't necessarily rebuild their lives. But that's not comparable to sending them off to this hellhole in El Salvador and saying you can never come back. Beyond that, it is blatantly a violation of the Constitution and the law. First of all, You can only deport people under the immigration laws. There's no other set of laws which says you can just deport U.S. citizens. And in fact,
that's why it's an exile. That's why that's the only good word to use.
Yeah, people without a country. You cannot deport U.S. citizens under the immigration laws. But it's also blatantly unconstitutional. Do you know what the Bill of Rights says about punishments?
No.
There cannot be cruel and unusual punishments. What could be more cruel and more unusual than sending U.S. citizens, whatever they may be convicted of is irrelevant. The prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment still applies. You know, this prison in El Salvador is the poster picture of cruel and unusual punishment. So not only is there a legal bar against sending U.S. citizens, whatever they were convicted of, in exile to another country, it clearly would violate the constitutional prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. In fact, much less cruel and unusual punishments have been prescribed by the U.S. Supreme Court. And here's an interesting thought, Sam. Why wouldn't that constitutional provision apply to anyone, regardless of their documentation or citizenship status, sent to the hellhole in El Salvador?
I don't know.
The Constitution applies to everyone in the U.S. It's not limited just to U.S. citizens. You can't go ahead and violate the Constitution, in my view, and I think most legal scholars would agree. I'm not a legal scholar, but I've studied a lot of history. You can't say just because you're an undocumented immigrant that the Constitution doesn't apply to you. Or, it's not clear that Albrego Garcia was an undocumented immigrant. He was in the U.S. under a court order from 2000.
Is that what we're talking about now?
We'll get to that.
Okay, I'm about to say, because
I just want to make the point. Not only would it clearly violate the U.S. Constitution to send U.S. citizens, regardless of their crime, to the hellhole in El Salvador, it may also violate the U.S. Constitution to send undocumented immigrants to the hellhole in El Salvador. And remember, none of these folks, as far as we know, were convicted of any crime in the United States. Trump, again, just waves the magic wand, says they're terrorists, members of dangerous gangs, and you can be deported to this virtual concentration camp in El Salvador. Absolutely no due process. Supreme Court has said even if you could invoke the Alien Enemies Act from 1798, it still requires due process. 14th Amendment saying you can't deprive people of life, liberty, or pursuit of happiness without due process still applies. But here's the other thing. Who enforces the law and the Constitution, Sam?
The executive branch?
Well, who checks on the executive branch to make sure they're conforming to the law and the Constitution?
The judicial branch.
The judicial branch. And what has been the attitude of Trump and his administration towards the judicial branch?
At the kindest way I could do it is twist the judicial branch's words to their own agenda.
Right. Or, I will put it the way I have before, even before a lot of the recent developments. They will not openly say, we are going to violate court orders, but they will do so by delay, obstruction, and attack, which is in effect the same as violating court orders. This is consistent with what Trump has done throughout his life. How did he escape prosecution in serious federal indictments?
Delay, deflect, all that jazz.
Delay, deflect, obstruct, attack. That goes all the way back to the early 1970s, when the United States Justice Department found that he was violating the Fair Housing Act by discriminating against minorities in his rental company in New York. You know who he hired to defend him?
Roy Cohn.
Roy Cohn, the notorious lawyer for the even more notorious red-baiting Joe McCarthy. And what did they do? Delay, obstruct, attack, until finally the case simply disappeared. Now, let's look at the current disappeared. We have the case of Albrego Garcia, who had never been convicted of a crime. He'd been living in the U.S. for 14 years, got 3 disabled children, has a wife, has been working hard all of those years. There was a 2019 court order which clearly said he could not be deported back to El Salvador. So what did they do to this guy, Sam?
Well, I think we should provide a little bit more context, because one thing that the Trump administration is doing is they're claiming a lot of things about this guy, and this guy's history is complex and nuanced and not the story that they're telling.
Not even close.
Can I take 2 seconds to just give a full picture of what's happening with this guy?
Sure.
So Albrego Garcia was born in San Salvador. A local gang growing up called Barrio 18 began essentially extorting his family for money, threatening to kill his older brother, et cetera, et cetera. So he was at threat from Barrio 18. He came here to the U.S. at 16. In 2019, he was apprehended by ICE. He was detained by ICE, and ICE told a immigration judge that he was part of MS-13. Now, Albrego Garcia told an immigration judge that he wasn't part of MS-13 and he'd like to seek asylum. There was a informant who claimed that Garcia was part of MS-13, but it was sketchy because the informant said that he was part of a New York chapter of MS-13 where he had never lived, and he was never
there.
Never there. He was never convicted of a crime. So in 2019, one immigration judge decided to jail Garcia while his immigration case continued, and the judge said that the informant was proven to be reliable and had verified Garcia's gang membership and rank. Again, Garcia still denies this, was still seeking asylum.
And the informant's information was absurd. Referred to as being a member of a gang in a place he never was.
5 months later, in October 2019, a different immigration judge denied Garcia's asylum request, but granted him protection from being deported back to El Salvador because of a well-founded fear of gang prosecution. He was released, and ICE did not appeal.
So that ruling is the last ruling that holds. But forget about all that.
Oh, so what was the point of saying that?
No, because I want to make another point, that regardless of all of that, Stephen Miller, the big far-right extremist advisor to Donald Trump, blatantly lied. He said that it was only a rogue, lunatic, Democratic plant who admitted that it was a mistake to send this guy back to El Salvador. A blatant lie, at least in 3 other occasions. Top administrative officials, including, I believe, the Solicitor General, the leading advocate for the government, admitted that it was administrative error and a mistake. So ever you want to read the 2019 history, and I think it clearly reads, you can't send him back to El Salvador. But regardless of that, the administration itself, multiple times, under oath, before a judge, admitted it was a mistake, an administrative error. It was a deportation that should never have been made. And then they tried to rewrite history by lying about it, blatantly lying about it. And, I saw the report, I think it was CNN, and they actually showed the testimony of these 3 officials under oath before a court. They had it, on the screen saying it was a mistake or administrative error. So this is, again, part of, the authoritarianism in a blender. Create chaos, continuing lie in Gish Gallop so people can't keep up with it, so your supporters will believe it. But there is no dispute, even among the administration itself, that this was a mistake and should be rectified. And Trump himself said, we can bring him back. If the Supreme Court says, bring him back, I'll bring him back. In other words, Trump admitted that they can bring him back.
But the Supreme Court did something very tricky. So
hold on with that.
Okay.
Before we get to the Supreme Court. And now, again, they've misrepresented, saying we can't bring him back because he is in the custody of a sovereign nation. And I'm going to get to why that is so chilling in a moment. But do you think for 1 second that if Trump, the most powerful person in the world, the patron of the president of El Salvador, who's given them millions of dollars to house these deportees, do you think for one moment, if Trump said, you got to release this guy so we can bring him back to the United States, Sam, do you think for one moment the president of El Salvador would have denied Donald Trump's request?
No.
Not for 1
I mean, did you see them they were sitting in the same room together on Monday?
I saw that, yeah. At a great love fest. But as I said, it's a contractual relationship. Trump has total leverage. Oh, and aside from that, he's not going to turn down a request from his patron, Donald Trump. So this is all nonsense. Now you can talk about the Supreme Court decision.
Well, yeah, I mean, I just want to point...
First, there was a lower court decision.
Right. Well, okay, one thing at a time. So I just want to point out that in this Oval Office meeting, Bukele, the president of El Salvador, was saying, I can't bring this quote-unquote terrorist back into he said the word smuggle.
Called him a terrorist, right?
Well, that's because the Trump administration has designated all MS-13 members as terrorists.
Is there any proof that this guy is a terrorist?
No.
Has he committed any acts of terror?
No. But I'm just telling you what Bukele said. Bukele says it's I can't say the word.
Preposterous.
Preposterous for people to think that I could, quote, smuggle a terrorist back into the United States. Meanwhile, as they're all sitting together, Pam Bondi and Trump say, and Marco Rubio say, well, it's up to El Salvador. Meanwhile, El Salvador is sitting there and saying, it's up to the United States. They're both passing the buck back and forth, and no one's ever going to take responsibility, it seems.
When has Trump ever taken responsibility for anything? Never. You know, with one word, he could release Albrego Garcia.
Right. If he want, and then what would the president of El Salvador say? He'd have to do it. You know
of course.
I mean? So,
the president of El Salvador is not going to stand up to the most powerful person in the world who's pumping millions of dollars.
Yes,
to him.
That's another thing that I want to talk about that I've seen people touch on, but not really go into depth about. As of last reporting Monday, I read that the U.S. government is paying the El Salvadorian government $6 million to house these deportations.
That's
right. So there's a great financial advantage for Bukele to do Trump's bidding. And I think people should not forget that always follow the money. There is a huge financial incentive for El Salvador to create prisons and become a exile territory for the United States, which is beyond the veil of human rights and et cetera, et cetera.
And Trump has said, we want you to build 5 more.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, as you said, more millions.
More money to Bukele,
right.
More money to their government. I mean, it's the sketchiest shit you could possibly imagine, and somehow it's just happening, and it seems like nobody can stop it.
It's the worst you can imagine. And here's why they are so adamant about bringing him back. It has nothing to do with his being a terrorist.
Not bringing him back.
Bringing him back. Because they want to send more to El Salvador. Yes. And they want to establish the precedent that once we snatch you off the street, even though you've committed no crime and we have no proof of anything that you're a danger to the country, once we send you to El Salvador, it's a done deal. You can never return again. That's why they're so adamant. It's why they lie so blatantly about this one case, which you wouldn't think off the top of your head would matter that much. What's the big deal of bringing this one guy back? To Trump and Stephen Miller and other hardliners, it's a huge big deal because they want to establish the precedent. They can snatch anyone off the street, send them to El Salvador, and they can never return. And now, as you say, they're talking about, against the Constitution and against the laws, sending U.S. citizens who are convicted of, quote unquote, whatever that means, violent crime, to these hellholes in El Salvador. Now, I want to get to the bigger picture. This harkens, first of all, to what Pastor Niemöller said about what was happening in Nazi Germany. Remember, Trump praised the Germans, saying, how kind they were to their prisoners. Yeah, the prisoners, they starved to death, put in cages not fit for animals, and murdered by the millions in the ovens. Those were the kind Germans. Any rate, here's what Pastor Niemöller said. I want to read now. I've paraphrased it, but I want to read to you the exact statement. First, they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. And then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. That's what happens in these dictatorships. They first go after the marginal people, right, who don't have a big constituency, who have no one to speak out for them. But that's just the first step. Once they can do that, and that's why they are so adamant about not bringing Garcia back. Once they can do that, that then opens the door, as we saw in Niemöller's statement, to disappear anyone that they want, send them to El Salvador, never to return. This harkens to another episode, the famous episode of the disappeared in Argentina. And once again, a corrupt American government, this time under Richard Nixon, was complicit in that. Richard Nixon and his immoral secretary, foreign policy advisor, Henry Kissinger, helped perpetrate a military coup in Argentina in 1973 that overturned the democratically elected government and installed a multi-year military dictatorship headed by General Pinochet. And one of the horrible things that General Pinochet did was to disappear people, pull them off the street, send them God knows where, and they're never heard from again. And so what Trump is proposing doing harkens back to, in our own hemisphere, in our more recent time, one of the most notorious episodes in the history of the world, the disappearing of the Argentine peoples under the brutal dictatorship of Pinochet.
Yeah, no doubt. Do we want to get into the Supreme Court and what they said? And there's a very...
No.
I just want to say one thing about it. There was a very tricky thing they did. So the lower court said that the U.S. government must effectuate and facilitate Garcia coming back home. But the Supreme Court took out the word effectuate.
And they said facilitate.
And they said only facilitate. And that has seemed to give the Trump administration 1,000 miles to twist this word facilitate into 1,000 different directions. You think the Supreme Court did that on purpose to give Trump that room? Why did they take that word out?
Probably in deference to Trump, yes.
Because effectuate is much, both are much stronger.
Much stronger words. But they sent it back to the lower court, and they had a hearing today. And Judge Zinnes blasted the administration because the Supreme Court also said you got to provide information on what you're doing to facilitate. And what information has the Trump administration provided? Zero. And the lower court just blasted the Trump administration. But Trump has said, I don't care what lower courts say, right? I might care what the Supreme Court says, but he doesn't seem to. But he seems willing to blatantly disregard what the lower court is doing, even though the Supreme Court specifically referred it back to the lower court to clarify matters.
Speaking of clarification, a couple of things to clarify. So Pinochet was a Chilean
I'm sorry, what did I say?
Argentine, yeah.
I meant Chilean.
Yeah.
A senior mistake, of course, I know that.
I've got some bad news. Wink Martindale died today.
Oh, my old buddy.
My dad's old TV show host.
In 1981, I was on Tic Tac Dough with Wink Martindale. He was the host who asked questions. And we stand absolutely at the opposite end of political spectrum. But I was on for 4 weeks. I defeated 20 opponents. I was the big winner of 1981. And Wink and I became close friends. And, at one point, Wink quipped, he said, Lichtman, I don't know how you answer these questions. I can barely read them correctly. We loved each other, even though. So my condolences to his friends and family. Wink and I did have, a few weeks of bonding way back when.
He was 91, so he lived a good...
81.
No, he was
he's 91 now.
Yeah,
I was on in 81.
No, he died at 91 years old, so he lived a good long life.
He did live a good long life. And one of the coaches of the New York Giants, their former defensive coordinator, named him... He was Martindale, and he named himself Wink after Wink Martindale.
Right.
All right.
Let me go through, because we're already almost at half an hour. Let me go through a couple housekeeping things, and then we can move on to our next topics. Is that okay? Or do you want to keep talking?
No, do the housekeeping, and I'm going to quickly go through a couple of other topics.
Okay. If you're not subscribed, guys, please subscribe. Click that notification bell so you know we're live. We got 1,300 people watching, almost 1,400, but only 482 likes. We got to get those likes up. Donations and memberships get priority in questions. We are also working on merch. So pinned in the chat is a form that you can fill out to help us facilitate. You get what I did there? Our merch.
Facilitate doesn't mean you have to do things.
Right.
Doesn't mean you can't do anything and still facilitate.
Right. So, get excited. We're doing some merch, and we'd like to hear your feedback. So check out that pinned chat and the form in that chat. All right, Dad.
I want to remind people, my course starts a week from tomorrow. 4 lectures and discussions. You can extensively talk with me and question me. It's going to be all on history. A lot of you said you wanted to hear more of what I have to say about history. Very hard to do in the context of the show when things are moving so fast. The Gish Gallop, the authoritarianism in the blender. But these 4 lectures and discussions will be totally devoted to the 4 pivotal elections in history, and our brilliant audience gets a 50% discount. So can we post the link?
Savannah, post the link. Don't pin it, because we want to keep the merch link up for this episode. But just post it if you can, Savannah, but don't pin it.
All
right. What's next for you, Dad?
Trump is an unprecedented way going after private institutions. He's gone after some of our finest universities, threatening to withhold hundreds of millions, or in the case of Harvard, billions of dollars of aid, on the absolutely phony pretext that they're violating the civil rights laws by not protecting Jewish students from anti-Semitism. Let me say 2 things. This administration doesn't care one whit about civil rights or the civil rights laws. They have dismantled the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. They have no intention of enforcing one of the most important pieces of legislation in U.S. history, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And they could not care less about anti-Semitism. Donald Trump is by far the most anti-Semitic president we've ever had. He's the guy who said the marchers in Charlottesville who were shouting, "The Jews will not replace us," are very fine people. He has said that if Jews don't vote for me, they're not good Jews. Thank you very much, Talmudic scholar Rabbi Donald Trump. He said if he would lose, he would blame it on the Jews. In the campaign of 2016, he posted a picture of Hillary Clinton with currency raining down upon her, and with a star that was an exact replica of the Star of David, reprising one of the worst anti-Semitic memes about Jews and money.
What would you say to people who...
Let me finish.
Okay.
Now I've lost my train of thought. Oh, who does Trump blame for everything in America?
I don't know.
George Soros, the Jewish Holocaust survivor. Trump and his allies blame Soros for virtually every ill in America. Trump blames Soros even for his indictment and conviction in the New York case, saying the prosecutor falsely was bought and sold by Soros. Trump and his allies have blamed Soros for paying black people to riot and kill white people. I could go on and on, but we have never seen such anti-Semitic rhetoric and acts even close by an American president. So this whole thing about anti-Semitism, it's just a mirage. It's just a front. It's just a pretext for Trump trying to impose on our institutions of higher learning his own politically driven, distorted view of American history and society. And I've talked about this before. If you want to see how distorted it is and how politically driven, look at the 1776 report that Trump sponsored at the end of his first term as a guidance for understanding American history and American society. Go ahead.
What would you say to people who say that his son-in-law is Jewish, his daughter is Jewish, he's one of the most staunchly pro-Israel presidents, he can't be anti-Semitic?
His words and actions speak for themselves. I don't know if he could have stopped his daughter.
But
let me finish.
Okay.
You've been interrupting me a lot.
No, I have not.
Yes, you have.
Oh my! You've been talking for. We've been going for 31 minutes. You've been talking for.
Go ahead.
28.
I'll stop.
No, go ahead.
I've lost my train again. Who knows if he could have stopped his daughter from marrying Jared Kushner? Plus, Jared Kushner was rich, fulfilling a Trump criterion. And being supportive of Netanyahu is not a demonstration of anti-Semitism. As I've said before, throughout my life, I have been as strong a supporter of Israel as a homeland for the Jews as anyone could. But support for Netanyahu is not equivalent to support for Israel or the Jews. In fact, I would argue, and most leaders and peoples around the world agree with me, Netanyahu is the worst thing that could possibly have happened to Israel and the Jews. He has made Israel and the Jews an international pariah. He's even under indictment by the International Criminal Court.
That's a good point.
One last thing.
Okay.
He's also gone after private law firms just because he doesn't like what they do. And one law firm that he's gone after is the law firm that successfully sued on behalf of Dominion, Fox News, and collected $787 million. That should be a sterling recommendation of that law firm, but Trump has tried to extort them by denying them privileges that the government can only grant, crippling to any law firm. And he's tried to do this to other law firms as well, and sadly a few have caved to him. Well, Judge Ali Khan, federal court judge, just issued a stinging rebuke, saying that what Trump is doing chills the firm's speech and advocacy, as well as threatens reputational harm. She went on to say the executive order is based on a personal vendetta. That is, the law firm did nothing wrong except successfully go after Fox News for perpetrating Trump's lies about the 2020 election. She went on to say, frankly, I think the framers of the Constitution would see this as a shocking abuse of power, just part of the authoritarianism in the blender.
I saw a Harvard professor say that, so if you're not, again, we kind of are blasting through this. If you're not familiar, Trump is using Title VI of the Civil Rights Act to justify all his actions against Harvard, which states it, that it prohibits discrimination on base of race, color, and national origin in programs and activities receiving federal finance assistance. So he's using Title VI as a justification to attack Harvard. But I heard a Harvard professor say today that even if you're to use Title VI, you have to first go through the courts, and a judge has to determine that said institution is in violation of Title VI before you start these actions against said institution, which, of course, they haven't done.
I can second that because I've been an expert in 110 civil rights cases, enforcing the civil rights laws. And guess what? In every one of those cases, to take action to remedy or punish civil rights violations, you're absolutely right, Sam. We had to go through an extensive court hearing, and we had to get a court order. But this, again, is indicative of everything that Trump is doing. He's doing things by fiat, as an authoritarian, not in any way going through due process, which is required. One last thing. What's this on the screen, Sam?
This is, how do I explain this? Well, maybe you should explain what the story is. A whistleblower
from the National Labor Relations Board has just come out and claimed that Dodge, under Elon Musk, has stolen sensitive data from the NLRB, National Labor Relations Board. Why should we care? Well, first of all, there is a massive conflict of interest here because Elon Musk is involved in various controversies with the National Labor Relations Board. And to the extent he could gain inside information about what they're doing, that would give him an enormous advantage in these disputes with the National Labor Relations Board. If that isn't bad enough, this data is sensitive for a reason. It has critical data on labor organizing and labor unions, and critical data on corporations, their proprietary secrets, and their practices. This is data that competitors and bosses who are fighting unions would love to have, and it's data, of course, that our adversaries, including Russia and China, would love to have. And he claims that this enormous spike in data access. And, you know, this picture speaks for 1,000 words, right, Sam?
Yeah, this is a screenshot that shows a large spike in outbound traffic leaving the NLRB system.
Right, when the Doge people are accessing the NLRB system. There's no one else who could have done this. And it gets worse. Apparently, the Russians tried to access what Musk and his employees were doing, and they seem to have had the codes to do it. The whistleblower says he thinks it was blocked, but you can believe the Russians and the Chinese, and maybe successfully, are going to continue to try to get access to this data, which they can use to undermine American business and undermine American labor. He's also provided additional documentation. Now, I don't understand this. Maybe you can explain it better than I.
So this is a screenshot of Doge engineer Jordan Wick's public GitHub account that shows, quote, NXGen BDOR extract, quote. That's the name of the file at the bottom of the screen that you're looking at. So the name itself suggests that Wick could have been designing a backdoor or BDOR to extract files from the NLRB's internal case management system.
Wow. Now, I wouldn't say this is 100% proof, but I would say it's 80 to 90% proof, both because he's documented the code and he's documented this amazing, I don't even know, hundreds of times greater spike in data. And this is consistent. It's not like this is an outlier. This is consistent with everything that Musk and Doge has been doing, constantly trying to get sensitive data, especially when there is a conflict of interest on the part of Musk and his entities. So I'd say, both given the evidence provided and the context, this is likely to be valid. And I heard an administration response, and it was just a generalization. Oh, Musk is, has great transparency. He's just trying to uncover waste and fraud. He's not doing anything wrong. Hardly a direct refutation of what the whistleblower demonstrated and had to say.
If you're not exactly sure what you're looking at, the bottom axis is time, right? So this is Tuesday the 4th, Wednesday the 5th. Well, I don't know what month this is. And this
is April, right?
I don't know. Could have been March.
Could be
March.
April.
It says 3/3 to 3/6. So this
it's
is
March.
And then this axis is
the bytes?
Gigabytes. Yeah, the bytes. So usually it's under a gig that's leaving the NLRB database. At this time on the 4th, it went up to over 93 gigabytes leaving the database.
So about 100 times.
At least, yeah.
At least 100 times or more. Even an old dinosaur like me can comprehend that, Sam.
There's a lot more to come out about this, but the initial findings or the initial whistleblower material is pretty crazy.
It's pretty crazy, pretty shocking, and unbelievably dangerous.
Yes.
All right.
Only 20 minutes left for questions, Dad.
I'll go a little over time.
What?
Yeah.
What?
I'm energized. I'm pumped. It's the authoritarianism blender. There's so much, being mixed together that I want to give our brilliant audience as much of a chance to ask me questions as possible.
Okay, our first question is from...
And don't forget, right, donors and members.
Donor kebabs and member kebabs.
Sounds good.
We have almost 1,500 people watching, but only 800 likes. Let's get that to 1,000 likes, guys. Come on. This is from one of our members, Joe Brooks. They say, Professor Lichtman, now that El Salvadorian President Nayib Bukele has refused to return Kilmar Albrego Garcia to the U.S., and the U.S. is saying it has no jurisdiction because Garcia is a citizen of El Salvador, and is refusing to facilitate his return as ordered by the Supreme Court, what are the next steps available, if any, to continue to combat this Gestapo-like behavior, either for Garcia's case or for preventing more such arrests and deportations?
Great question. Two things. One, get it back to the Supreme Court and get a stronger ruling. Then you can throw in Trump's face his statement that if the Supreme Court says to bring him back, I'll bring him back. But what do you think Trump will do when confronted with that statement, which he usually does when confronted with embarrassing things that he said? He'll deny it. I never said that. I never meant that.
Right.
Time and again, he's denied saying things that are recorded, that are filmed, that are documented. The other thing that the lower court can do, there's not a lot of power they have, but they can hold all of these federal officials, the lawyers, the immigration officials, and maybe even the president. I don't know about that, but certainly all these other officials in contempt. Now, what that might mean is unclear because Pam Bondi, Trump's loyal attorney general, I never thought he could find more of a sycophant than Bill Barr, but he's managed to do that. And remember, I predicted that. I said, Matt Gaetz was a feint. He'd appoint someone like Pam Bondi, who is just as bad, if not worse. Of course, she doesn't have the baggage. So there's limited things, but nobody wants a finding of contempt of court on their record.
Trump just had another pro-Palestinian Columbia student, a legal permanent resident since 2014, arrested and deported during his citizenship interview. This violation and suppression of First Amendment rights at its worst. I'm left speechless by this. I can't even form a coherent question to ask. Could you please discuss this during your show?
Right. The chaos authoritarian blender. He doesn't care. He will go after anyone that he wants to, regardless of the law. This is, perhaps even more outrageous than what was done to Albrego Garcia. During a citizenship interview, when someone, is going through the sacred process of becoming a U.S. citizen, ICE barges in and arrests this person. I wonder again if this person had violated any law. I doubt it, or they wouldn't be going through a citizenship interview. I don't know for sure, But, I just saw some data from the University of Syracuse that tracks these things. And the vast majority of those arrested and detained under Trump's deportation push have no criminal record. The vast majority. And even those few who have criminal records, for the most part, it's for minor crimes like traffic violations. Remember, I talked about this last time. I wrote a whole op-ed on this in the South Florida Sun-Sentinel, warning based on the Florida experience under their anti-sanctuary cities laws, that the brunt of the enforcement is going to come to people with no criminal record or an inconsequential record.
Nan B says, I did not know that a president could ignore the Supreme Court and just nothing happens to him. Is this a first?
Well, there was some controversy about whether Andrew Jackson ignored or didn't ignore the Supreme Court order on Indian removal. But you had an act of Congress establishing Indian removal. So he hasn't quite ignored the Supreme Court. He's kind of, as Sam said, with a torrent of lies and distortions, misrepresented what the Supreme Court says. Push will come to shove if those go back to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court unambiguously orders Donald Trump to bring Mr. Garcia back.
Right. Pam Bondi said yesterday that if El Salvador released him, they would provide a plane, and if that happened, then they would be following the court order. So, they're trying to muddy the legal waters and twist it into such a knot that nobody can really understand what the hell is happening.
Right. That's exactly what I said. They will not blatantly say they will violate the Supreme Court order, but in practice they will do so.
Effin Music Man says, if the House and Senate flip to the Dems in 2026, does that all but guarantee Trump's impeachment?
Well, maybe not. He's been impeached twice, and I wouldn't say acquitted, but not convicted and removed twice. You did have the unprecedented situation of a bipartisan minority voting to convict. And even the Republicans who didn't vote to convict, headed by Mitch McConnell, did not deny the seriousness of the insurrection and Trump's inciting it, but they said, this was a matter for the criminal justice system, not for impeachment. And what happened with punting it to the criminal justice system, Sam?
Nothing happened.
Supreme Court gave Trump immunity.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Sorry, I wasn't really listening.
Yeah, that's okay. You don't have to listen. Your more important thing is to take care of the technologies. So I think the Democrats might be very reluctant to impeach again, and then it's incredibly unlikely, you get enough Republican senators, although you got 7 last time, you would need something on the order of, depending on how the Senate went, 15 to 17.
So George is asking or stating, and this is sort of Marco Rubio's stance, that the Supreme Court can't enforce bringing back Garcia because it's a foreign policy matter outside the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court.
That's absolute nonsense. There's nothing in the law which says because you pronounce something foreign policy, it's outside the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. It's not even clear this involves foreign policy. What foreign policy matter is at stake with bringing back this one guy? What foreign policy goals would be undermined? And plus, as I said, there's nothing in precedent or the Constitution which says Supreme Court can't deal with foreign policy matters. Supreme Court dealt with the internment of the Japanese Americans. Much more critical element of foreign policy than this. And even more on point, during the Korean War, Harry Truman seized the steel mills as a matter of essential national security. Supreme Court stepped in and said you can't do that. That's unlawful. So this is A, this isn't a matter of foreign policy, and B, the idea that the Supreme Court cannot touch an issue where the government says it's foreign policy is just not the case.
Take a sip of that drink. What are you drinking today, Dad?
I am drinking Spendthrift carbonated water.
Spindrift? Mm-hmm. What did you say? Spandraft?
Spendthrift. Close.
Close. Can you break down the SAVE Act's chances of passing and what women can do to protect our franchise? I'm a widow, and my 2 public policy degrees have my married name on them, but I'm mostly willing to legally switch back to my birth certificate name if it will protect my right to vote and ability to get a passport/relocate.
The SAVE Act is one of the most pernicious impositions in the right to vote we've ever seen emanating from the federal government. It really harkens back to the disenfranchisement of the Jim Crow era. It requires that you now have to show documentation with your name on it to register to vote. 20 million or so married women don't have the same name, plus many millions of other American citizens don't have the papers. Not everyone has papers to prove their citizenship. This show me your papers idea is just antithetical to America's tradition. We should making it easier to vote, not harder. And the justification that we want to prevent illegal aliens from voting, or aliens in general, is absolute nonsense. Those charges have been made time and time and time again over the years and have been proven to be totally wrong. There is no problem with aliens or illegal aliens voted. That's not the fabrication. Let's make something up and use it as our justification. But fortunately, and, I can maybe comfort our questioner, this will take 60 votes in the Senate, and I don't think that's going to happen.
That's good.
Stop a filibuster.
That's good news.
Yeah.
We've got 950 likes, Dad. We're only less than 50 away from 1,000. Let's push it to 1,000.
How close are we to 10?
To 10 what?
10 o'clock.
Oh, 10 minutes.
10 minutes. I'm
9
willing
minutes.
to go overtime.
Wow. And I'm going to...
Not grossly overtime.
We got 1,500 people watching. I'm asking each and every one of you to share this episode on some social media platform that you have. Reddit, X, Facebook, Instagram. I want each and every one of you to share this episode because we want this episode to be heard by a lot of people because it's a very important episode. And there's a lot of lies and there's a lot of nonsense swirling around. And we want people to watch and hear the truth from this man.
Even though I got chili in Argentina, I'm a little dyslexic.
Oh, right, that is true. You do get chili in it.
Age.
That's all people are gonna focus on. This guy's an idiot. He said Argentina, but it was Chile.
I know it was Chile. Is my course discount up for people to click onto?
It was when you told it to be.
All right, put it up again.
All right, put it up again, but don't pin it.
We need to make this course work. We need people signed up for it.
All right. Next question.
Yes.
In recent weeks, China has been consolidating influence with South Korea, Japan, EU, Southeast Asia, and indeed the rest of the world, or 94% of civilization. Meanwhile, Trump regime is busy caging themselves with tariffs and war threats. Professor, is it fair to say that the Trump regime is counterintuitive to making America great?
Trump regime is not making America great abroad, which is what your question refers to. We've already dealt a lot with what he's doing at home. What he's doing is making America isolated and hated abroad through his withdrawal from aid programs, which enables the Chinese and the Russians to step in, to withdrawal from the Paris Accords on climate change, the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization. Through his tariffs, he's obviously throwing those Asian nations right into the hands of the Chinese.
Member Avinash Sabesan, that's quite a name.
It's quite a name.
They say, do you think Trump should be investigated for insider trading, for crashing the markets on April 3rd/4th, tweeting about holding stocks on April 9th that morning, and canceling most of the tariffs in the afternoon, causing the stock market to shoot back up?
I can't say he engaged in insider trading. It hasn't been investigated.
Do you think it should be?
Absolutely. But is it going to be under Pam Bondi or the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission? What are the chances?
Close to zero.
I'd say not close to zero, but an absolute zero.
This is from one of our Discord members. If you want to join the Discord, the link to that is in the link tree in the description of this video. This is from Mr. Frundles. They say, Professor, judging from history and what you know about it, will invoking the Insurrection Act and or martial law mark a point of no return for this administration? If so, what can we do? If not, what does it actually mean?
Well, we are, coming very close to a point of no return. This was the whole point of our main topic today, that Trump is channeling what dictatorships do, and specifically what Pinochet did in Chile, in disappearing people simply because he can and simply because he doesn't like them. We've also seen, in so many other ways, how Trump is defying the law and the Constitution. Let's hope the Supreme Court steps in and takes strong action against it. I think, it's a 50-50 chance at this point, and then we would be at a flashpoint in our history. But I've said many times there are things you can do. Contact your congressperson, your senator, support organizations like CREW and ACLU that are challenging what Trump is doing. Speak out in your local community. Write to your local newspaper. Organize. Vote. If you're a lawyer, get involved in these cases. We don't have to be passive. We can take action. And above all, support this show.
Member Suzanch says, if the voter suppression bill passes, which is the SAVE Act, right?
The SAVE Act.
Would it affect the jury selection of our peers?
Of course it would.
How so?
It would bias it because jury selection is often based upon registered voters. And if people who are marginal people who don't have documentation are prevented from registering, that is going to tilt jury selection in favor of the more privileged white people in America.
Right, that makes sense. This is from Mark Schloss. They say, Donald Trump's leadership style, often described as transactional, and it's been compared to historical figures who prioritize deal-making and pragmatic exchanges over ideological or technocratic governance. One example is Richard Nixon, who, like Trump, emphasized strategic negotiations, such as his opening of diplomatic relations with China. Another comparison could be drawn to Silvio
Berlusconi.
Thank you. The former Italian prime minister, known for his business-oriented populist approach and focus on personal branding. These leaders, while differing in context and outcomes, share a focus on leveraging personal relationships and immediate gains rather than adhering to broader ideological framework. What do you think about these parallels?
Well, do we have an hour?
Woo!
But you don't know anything about Berlusconi.
No.
But he chose as his model, or her, two of the most corrupt politicians of recent times, Berlusconi in Italy and, of course, Nixon in the United States. But leaving that aside, I'm going to focus on Nixon because, the example is much closer. There is no comparison between Nixon and Trump. For all his faults, and he was twisted and paranoid, Nixon was brilliant. He was informed. He understood international relations. He understood politics. He knew how to negotiate. He knew how to make deals. None of that applies to Donald Trump. Donald Trump, portrays himself as the art of the deal. As I pointed out before, almost all of Trump's deals have fallen through. No one's benefited except Trump. So the idea that you can compare Trump to Nixon beyond their common corruption just doesn't hold water.
As a Canadian citizen, if I travel to the U.S. today, I've been advised by my Canadian government that border officials have the authority to check my personal phone. What are your views on this, and is it worth traveling to the U.S. as a visitor?
I can't speak to that. I don't know what Canadian border officials have the authority to do, what it means to check your personal phone. Does that mean to check whether you have one or to get into it? So I hope not. I hope, if they do check phones, it's just to see if you have one and they don't break into your private communications. And you have to make the decision on your own about traveling to the U.S. And we're providing information that maybe can help you with that decision.
Ali says, what would be the implications of SCOTUS allowing Trump to remove current Fed chair and installing a loyalist?
Well, it would be another example of, if they do this, and I'm not saying they're going to, another example of the Supreme Court enabling Trump and letting Trump do what Trump wants to do without consequences.
Taylor Montgomery asks, is privatization of Amtrak and the USPS a real possibility? Can you add some historical context on how horrible an idea this is? For example, how Britain privatized their rail, then had to bail it out anyways.
Yeah, privatization experiments have never worked well, as you saw the example of what's happened in Britain. It was a disaster. The problem with privatizing public services, and we saw that with privatization of utilities in the United States and railroads. The problem is, once it becomes private, is the motivation now to serve the public, or is there another motivation for a private corporation?
Money, money, money.
Money, money, money. Exactly.
Money. How was that?
That's why privatization is so dangerous.
We're up to 1,100 likes. Can we get to 1,200 likes?
Wow.
That's my question. Can we get to 1,200 likes? We've just hit 10 p.m. on the East Coast of the United States of America, Dad.
Let's go.
Let's go.
Are you doing a after show?
I will be doing an after show, yes.
I don't want to cut into that too much.
No, don't worry about it.
4 more questions. How about that? Wow, I'm going over time because this is so important. This cuts to the heart of our democracy and our freedom. If Trump can just pick up anyone he wants without due process, without a court order, send him to El Salvador, and then say, sorry, we're like Chile of the 1970s.
I think it's Chile.
Chile, yes.
Not Chile. Maybe I called it Chile.
No, it's
earlier.
Chile.
Molly B wants to know how/why has Trump been allowed to get away with all this?
First of all, he has a very strong base. Secondly, he won the election. And he is the most powerful person in the world. Thirdly, he's doing what he's been doing ever since he was found violating the Fair Housing Act in the early 1970s, obstructing, delaying, attacking, and presuming he can do anything he wants and face no consequences. And so far he hasn't.
I have more reasons why. One, because he's got a MAGA Congress. So
that's important.
Congress is going to hold him available. You know what I'm trying to say.
Congress isn't going to do anything against him.
Right. And 2, the mechanisms of democracy and justice move very slowly. And
they're delicate.
And this Trump administration seems to know that very well, and they are moving as fast and chaotically as humanly possible. A planned strategy to combat the slow-moving mechanisms of democracy.
Correct. And I would refer you to my book, 13 Cracks, Repairing American Democracy After Trump, which exactly documents the points you've made about the slow-moving, delicate guardrails of democracy.
Sean Matthew says, why is King Leopold II's role in the death of millions in the Congo Free State not taught with the same depth or emphasis as Adolf Hitler's atrocities during the Holocaust, especially considering the scale of violence and exploitation King Leopold oversaw?
Yeah, there's a wonderful book on that called King Leopold's, I forget the...
Ghost.
King Leopold's what?
Ghost,
yeah. Terrific book. And yes...
I've read it.
Wow, I didn't think you were reading books.
See,
it's a great book. And it does, maybe not quite the scale of the Holocaust, but it does rival it. But the truth is, we're still very much a white, European-oriented society, and we tend to focus more on things that happen in Europe than happen in places like Africa. And I wish there would be more emphasis on the atrocities committed under King Leopold's watch in the Congo.
This is from my good friend Ian. They say, Professor, can you talk about the 80th anniversary of FDR passing last Saturday? For 80 years, we lived in FDR's world. How did the country mourn him? Did your parents talk to you about him? So it's been 80 years.
Again, that's going to take an hour, but I'll give a short answer. My dad was kind of a curmudgeon. Great guy, but an old curmudgeon. Even a young curmudgeon, I have to say. He hated everyone except Sam, FDR. He loved FDR. He thinks FDR saved the country from ruin during the Great Depression and led the country through war. And today, FDR is remembered as one of our three greatest presidents. You know who the other two were?
Our three, just generally thought of?
Generally regarded as our three greatest presidents. FDR.
George Washington.
Come on.
Don't tell me the third.
The next one's
Is it really obvious?
Obvious.
Abraham Lincoln.
Exactly.
Okay.
So he is remembered in the great pantheon of American presidents. It was interesting that he didn't want, we now have a big memorial, but he didn't want a big memorial. He just wanted a very simple headstone to remember himself by. And he insisted to his confidant, Felix Frankfurter, that that's all that he wanted. Even right-wingers, believe it or not, are hesitant to go after FDR and heap some praise in him. I remember Newt Gingrich, about as far right as you can get in sort of respectable American politics, very much praising the leadership that FDR exhibited. One more question.
Final question of the night is from Walter Dominics. They say, now that we are officially a dictatorship, that's their opinion.
Well, I'm not quite there yet.
Please take us back in history and help us find the proper way back to democracy. How did the Allies save Germany? Why did the Allies save Germany? Can Allies save America?
Well, it's a very different situation. It was the occupation of Germany and the imposition of a new constitution and at least the partial denazification of Germany that restored German democracy, and then later the end of the Berlin Wall and the consolidation of East and West Germany. So there isn't that model really for the U.S. Again, look at my book, 13 Cracks, Repairing American Democracy After Trump, for answers. And I also, just a few minutes ago, I think outlined 5 ways in which you as an individual can act to try to save our democracy.
One really quick question from Christopher, our Discord mod. They say, hey, Dr. Lichtman and Sam, the Canadian elections are coming up on the 28th. Would you guys hold coverage like you did back in November? I think it would be great for viewership. What do you think?
Absolutely.
Really?
Yeah, one of the things that we've done well with...
You're like 5 feet away from me.
Yeah.
Come on here, guy.
Yeah. Whoa. One of the things we've done well with is covering things live.
Right.
Did real well with the speech and the special elections. So, yes, we will plan to do that. Publicize it as much as you can.
Publicize it. And like I said, everybody's got to share. Everybody watching has got to share this episode.
And sign up for my lectures and discussions.
And discussions. And the good news is that the Lichtman Live post show is coming up right after this. Dad, what are your final words to the people on this night, April 15th? 2025.
I will quote the great sage of the Constitutional Convention of 1787, Benjamin Franklin, when he was asked by a woman, no less, and women didn't involve themselves, weren't allowed to involve themselves much in politics. When she asked Benjamin Franklin, what was the result of this convention, Dr. Franklin? And he answered very simply, a republic if we can keep it.
All right, with that, we will sign off for the night. Some donations that didn't get read: Timbo Slice, Vladimir Planton, Philip H., 80 Mart, and Ryan Gallagher. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Guys, the Lichtman post show is coming up right now. Savannah, if you could post the link to that in the chat. You all should be automatically, we have this really cool thing in YouTube now, that they should be automatically taken to the post show after this one ends. So stick around there. I'll be live in a few minutes. Say goodnight, Dad.
Good night, and we'll keep, as best we can, keeping you informed of issues that directly affect